What happened? Welcome to a Not Just Gaming news series with bits of news, rumors, and more about gaming. Subscribe if you want more and keep an eye out for reviews including Banishers coming up soon. First up, Final Fantasy Code 4 Rebirth is out and the review embargo is February 22nd at 9 a.m. Eastern Time. Journalists have for sure got the game as early as Friday of this week, so be prepared for spoilers everywhere once more people get hands on the review code and we get the inevitable leaks that we've been seeing. While it's easy to assume that means everybody's confident in the game, as this review embargo is a week early. While that overall myth has been shattered many times, I think we can all assume that most likely Rebirth will have the same or better quality than the original episode in the series, which scored gangbusters. Rebirth, as the second episode in the 3-game arc retelling the original Final Fantasy VII, is one of 2024's largest and most anticipated titles by me. Cannot wait to cover that game. It's crazy to remember that the original game was released in 1997, which is probably earlier than many of you were actually birthed yourselves, but here we are. Final Fantasy Rebirth is estimated to be around 40 to 50 hours for the main game, and around 100 if you do everything. Time will tell if that mets out. When you look at this is a massive game in a massive year, and code is out there, meaning we are right there ready to review it. Next up, more rumors about Microsoft. So, on the opposite side of the console war, Jez Gordon from Windows Central states he's heard it from two sources that Microsoft is looking at either some or all Microsoft titles being published on other platforms. Now, there isn't any discussion on the timing for this, with exclusivity for a year or two, or perhaps none for some of these titles. However, a lot of these companies are starting to see the changes in gaming, and leaving that money on the table isn't making sense. This is also reported by Xbox Era, who states that not only is Jez right, but that Microsoft has invested in more Sony developer kits for some of their teams, specifically around Starfield and later games. Now, we don't know if one of Jez's sources is actually Xbox Era, but I wanted to discuss this. Xbox Era also reported that internally the discussion revolved around financial reasons to put these games on more devices, and that internally senior leadership at Microsoft have argued back and forth about it for some time. Now, this is something that almost all of the big companies do, and the same discussion occurred around service games for Sony and the Switch there. We saw that with the internal leak documents in various different stages, and the same thing with Microsoft. However, it does seem like both sources are indicating that this isn't for every title. It's some kind of select style of release where developers are going to be looking at other platforms like PlayStation and I think indeed Switch 2 to decide what to do. But to dive into this a little bit further, the next story I'm going to cover is about service games and how many developers in the industry are looking at that. Also, when you look at the platform holders, for years Sony was a holdout and then jumped to PC, and I think rightfully so, and it makes sense. Microsoft, using PC and Xbox, rightfully so, has decided to start looking out at other platforms. Now, ignoring the console warrior thing, or just the idea that you might be invested in one console or the other, the idea that you might be able to play games, particular ones that you identify with on a particular platform, on a different platform, isn't really something that bothers me too much. I do understand why some people feel like it's a big deal. It's in the same vein as a lot of people felt that the service games from Sony and the change there was a big deal. A lot of people felt the same way when the Switch was announced as a handheld, and people felt that sort of the actual home console market was being ignored by Nintendo at that time. But I think when we look at the financials of games today and how some games are done and how much they cost and the development behind them, it is starting to make sense why we're seeing some of these decisions, whether I love them personally or not. I'd like to know what you guys think. I know there's going to be a lot of heated debate around it, but be aware it's a piece of plastic. So in the end, don't be too mean to each other in the comments. Is it true that over 95% of developers are currently aiming to make service-based games? So recently, Griffin's Gaming Partners, which is a venture capital firm, released an interesting report on the future of gaming that they got by polling a ton of developers. Within the report, an astonishing 95% of 537 studios polled responded, stating they have a service game planned or in current progress. First of all, how do you guys feel about that? Second, I'm going to dive into this and break it down a little bit. We're going to do some of that on Wednesday's podcast at 10:30 Pacific Standard Time. But this report is filled with information from games and companies using specific engines, the difficulty between building your own tech and buying off-the-shelf technology, and even server infrastructure cost and planning. While Griffin's report broadly defines service games as those with a regular update schedule, they did separate that from those with simple patches and maintenance, meaning that while the actual study isn't identical in the terms of live service and the definition slightly more narrowed that gamers use, regular updates doesn't really indicate what we're talking about here. But it really shouldn't come as any surprise, with even Sony indicating that they were going to a massive move of 12 titles that they had in the works that were live service games last year. Now, while 6 of those titles have been delayed, and one of those, the rumor is being gutted or revised completely away from a service game style, still a tremendous jump in the genre of games from a noteworthy single-player company like Sony. To dive into this further, let's look at service-based games, MMOs, and co-op games, and we already notice there's an overlap now of what we're getting in that territory, when even the discussion around what a service game is can get a bit confusing. However, it's easy to indicate from this report that many companies are looking at this model. We've also seen developers and publishers continue to try mixed various methods and models to get away from the service game title. So expect all manner of new names and PR wording around this as we evolve through 2024 and 2025. Things like Evolving World, or Evolutions, or even worse, dynamic game events. Companies and gamers don't like the service game moniker, but changing the name or using other words has already resulted in titles like Suicide Squad being called out for just not using that category for their game. More importantly, in this report, many of the developers were asked and indicated that the move to different models is not compatible with the way prior games were released or developed. For example, the CEO of IO Interactive stated very clearly, "Games aren't just content, they're software too. With live services, we're consistently delivering software to a living, breathing product. Studios need to be ready and embrace the always shipping mindset early on during development and use the same pipelines and workflows even for internal builds." We have definitely noticed this becoming an issue with games that hedge the line between a service game and a single-player title. For example, Suicide Squad's adding an offline mode to their game in a patch. But other titles have also run into situations where the consistent grind of updating and roadmaps seems set up in almost a mini expansion way, and player churn becomes higher and higher as the content releases are staggered out in larger degrees, more like expansions. That's why we're seeing companies identify earlier that they plan on shorter updates and more frequent ones. For example, Helldiver devs have stated on Twitter they have a ton of content planned, all free, and that game isn't even out yet. Again, make sure to check out Griffin Gaming Partners' website and that link in the description. Another topic of interest here is that on custom versus off-the-shelf tools. While many companies are looking to check out and make decisions on if they use technology, including game engines or back-end server technology, from off-the-shelf companies, one huge weakness stated here continues to be support for that product versus a simple purchase and push mentality. This is absolutely vital now for companies like Unreal and the back-end server companies to make sure that they offer continued support so that during game development, especially in the early sections, support can be assured for these titles to make those quick iterative updates. The same report showed that over 40% of 537 studios were using Unreal Engine, with over 250 working on what they consider to be casual games, and that testing for games is being outpaced by pure player time dramatically, stuff that we'll break down more in the podcast. But that does move us to the next bit of news, and that's Palworld. Not only has Palworld sold basically all the copies, over 19 million players, 7 million of them on Xbox, luckily, some of that hot cash is going towards their servers running, with the game developers stating they spend almost $500,000 a month to make sure the servers stay up. Let's just look at what the Palworld lead engineer stated. They stated in Twitter, following the order to never let the service go down no matter what, we've prepared servers without regard to cost. We will continue to give our all to ensure that all players can enjoy to the fullest. And then they indicated $478,000. That's nearly $6 million, I think, give or take, especially as the game gets updated, new players jump in, and others jump out as new titles do end up coming in 2024. That's a very good indicator that the absolutely mind-numbing numbers that not only the game has done, but that tech and server technology can cost across the year for companies with these online components we talked about. In this day and age, with most games launching with all kinds of connection issues, Palworld's actually been surprisingly light in problems, other than the Xbox version being behind the PC version and certification being pointed out as the issue. Something I talked about a little bit earlier in that report, which is that companies need to make sure that they support the developers. While Palworld has had some connection issues day one, and many online games do, it's incredible to see how few they have really had. And Steam's all-time high concurrent for Palworld was over 2 million. And that doesn't include Xbox. People like throwing balls at animals and capturing humans. Who knew? Something that we do know is that gamers like a plethora of different games in any genre. That brings us to the Metro series. While Metro for PSVR 2 and PC VR was shown at the Sony Direct, the developers for the game have cleared up any worries for gamers that the VR game would be the only title that they're making, that they state is coming purely in the Metro series, not connected to VR. In a Twitter post, the developers pointed that out and that another mainline title was coming. This is exciting news, as Metro titles have been excellent, with Metro 1 doing insane scores, 2 doing awesome, and Exodus being an incredible game. With Stalker 2 also coming, fans of shooters based somewhere other than some backwater western state or Cuba should be very happy to see more games coming along in the FPS genre that sort of changes locales. I don't know about you, but the more titles that we get in the FPS genre, the happier I am. And when we see past, future, we see different locations, and we see just different nationalities and how they show us first-person shooters, I'm excited for it. I did end up liking Atomic Heart a great deal. I've liked the Stalker games and the Metro games, so more in this series, super exciting for me. Speaking about more in a series, let's talk a little bit about another series that for a long time has been delivering great titles and looks to be delivering more. Leaker Dust Golem has stated that Capcom currently has up to 5 Resident Evil games in development now. Now, I want to talk about this in the leaks section because Dust Golem's been right more times than he's been wrong with Capcom-specific news, pointing that out. And while games and times change and developments adjust, games are canceled or new games are started, there's enough here that I think the discussion makes sense. Sadly, the information didn't include what games are new, what games were remakes, but let's just say this. My hope is that finally we get a Code Veronica rumored remake, and it rears its head. For many years, Veronica's been treated like other ignored stepkids in games like Batman Origins or Fallout New Vegas when it comes to remakes and remasters, and just getting that touch-up. Wesker's voice actor responded to a Game Awards Twitter when asked what game they were looking forward to the most, and responded as well, stating, "The one I am currently working on." Now, we can identify that as a Resident Evil, but that person probably does other voice work. One thing to remember is that the Resident Evil games, new and remakes, continue to score dramatically well and sell even better. For example, Resident Evil 7 Biohazard's at 86%, Evil Village is at 84%, and of course Resident Evil 2 Remake is at 92%. Resident Evil 3, the remake, not so much. When we look at big developers releasing tons within a series, whether it be Assassin's Creed, Resident Evil, or others, Capcom really has nailed it. They've had a good stable of titles that are fresh, new. They've also had a good stable of titles that go back to their original IPs. And the remasters, other than, like I said, 1 or 2, have done phenomenally well. I'm excited for this. We can sort of treat this as a little bit of a pinch of salt when it comes to a rumor like this, but I think we all know Capcom is obviously looking at the remake structure, and they've done very well with it, and there's no assumption whatsoever that they're just going to magically stop. It's just, when are we going to get Code Veronica? Because I don't know about you, it's one of my favorite Resident Evil games ever. Moving on from long series, let's talk a little bit about baby bits of news, as I like to call it. First, the Ascent devs are working on FPS cyberpunk-style Deus Ex shooter. This was confirmed by Alex on Digital Foundry for just a moment in his Stalker 2 video, where they talked about a behind-the-scenes look at Stalker 2. This was a short bit of information that I didn't seem to notice. I guess some other people have reported it. A couple people this morning reported it, and I wanted to talk about it for a second. We broke down Deus Ex and everything we loved on last Friday's podcast, and sat for almost 2 hours and discussed what we wanted to see from a Deus Ex or a cyberpunk-style shooter in the future, Shadowrun included, any title really, and how they want to do it, because I firmly believe in the first-person shooter market, cyberpunk is not necessarily well represented, other than the big elephant in the room. So seeing the Ascent devs working on this is awesome. I did a walking the walk for the Ascent itself and used the third-person camera unlocker to look around, and there was a great deal going on in that game world that you didn't see in that isometric style format. If you get a chance, check that video out. If you don't, I can just say this. They had a lot going on in that game that you didn't even see. I'm excited, and I actually think the Ascent devs working on this is probably one of the perfect devs to be doing so. When Alex was talking about this, he also stated that it reminded him a great deal of Deus Ex. Next up with a bit of news, Star Wars Outlaws is coming mid-2024 unless delayed. And in other news, Bethesda's bringing FSR 3 to Starfield in the coming weeks. This pops up after the most recent patch that really dramatically improved lighting in that game. I know we're all waiting for the full mod tools so people can jump in there tear it apart and put what they want into the game. I'm excited for this. I think any kind of technical improvement you can get in a game, and FSR 3 is much better than the prior versions. So seeing those improvements, that's great regardless of what game it's in. Bringing FSR 3 to it is just another boon for those people who want to play it or are continuing to play it. Subscribe to these if you like them. Subscribe to the channel if you want to see reviews. We got a bunch coming. I'm finally back somewhat on the mend from 10 days of no power as well as COVID. So I'm hoping to continue to bring you guys videos that you enjoy. If you like these, I would love for you to comment, thumbs up, discuss what you think of these news, and hit up the comments with news that I didn't get to hit because, you know what? Otherwise, the video would be like 7 hours long. Peace out.